Hi everybody, so this deck finally arrived at my doorstep today. This is the Moonchild Tarot. I have pre-ordered this a while back. I can't quite remember when exactly. Some of you may know that I struggle to get along with the Starchild Tarot, which is by Danielle Noel as well. She's an artist in Canada. And part of the reason as to why that was because Danielle Noel's cosmology isn't quite in line with mine. And also her aesthetic in terms of depiction of the tarot used a lot of human images, which I find really hard to identify with. Knowing that though, I'm a great admirer of her in terms of the craft of deck making. Her Starchild Tarot is one of the most beautiful tarot deck I've ever had the privilege to touch and shuffle. It is unfortunate that after a year, I just couldn't use it as a tarot deck. And so I had to sell it. There's a whole long story there, which I will talk about some other time. But when I heard that the Moonchild is going ahead, and when I remember how the Moonchild was in its first conception, if you recall from some of the images that she posted, I was hopeful that perhaps the Moonchild might work better for me. However, you would also notice that the aesthetic of the current Moonchild that we have now is quite different from how Moonchild was initially conceived or envisioned, or if you I don't know whether those images are still there, but if you go to her earlier post of how the Moonchild looked like, it looks very vintage. It looks very, very early 1900s, late 1800s, with antique ivory paper that looks a little aged, with the brushed muted gold around it, thin border around it. And the images that she chose for collage look very much like images from the late 1800s and early 1900s, just at the early days of photography. Whether those images are actually vintage or not, I don't know, but they certainly look vintage. And now though, the Moonchild that we have here though feels more like a maturation of the artwork or of the aesthetic of the Starchild. Although you can see elements of the old Moonchild here, and when I say the old Moonchild, I meant the images and the feel of Moonchild as she presented to us in the earlier stages, you see a lot more of the aesthetic of Starchild here. So that's the back. So the back perhaps is more in line with that early 1900s Art Nouveau, Art Deco sort of photos from that period. But the coloration and a lot of the photos here are obviously, or I don't know whether I want to say obviously, but they do look more modern, shall we say. They look more modern. So this is definitely modern. This is one of the images that I saw online that I quite like. I really like that. And so it's really promising, and this definitely feels more Starchild than the old Moonchild. When I say the old Moonchild, again, the initial Moonchild, the first draft Moonchild. The lovers here again feels quite modern. The people are more diverse though, which I quite like, and their poses are less fashion magazine like. That's the only way I can explain the feel that I got from Starchild. And I do appreciate that the Starchild have worked very well for a lot of people. I just want to comment that although I'm a big believer in diversity, I look at the lovers as the unification of polarity, yin and yang. And so for me, it's important to see both feminine and masculine in the lovers card. Oh, before I continue, I just want to say how lovely this is, how much I dig this one here, this aesthetic here, this mixture and combining of this colored lushes antique and modern collage in here with this understated monochromatic ones over here. I just absolutely adore this. This is perfection for me. And I don't know if I've showed you this before. I've been coughing quite a bit, so I have to redo this several times. But this is three-dimensional. You can run your fingers on this and you can feel three-dimensional bumps. So the 3D look or feel here is both two-dimensional drawing of shadings to create this three-dimensional look, but it is also complemented with a kind of printing process, which name I completely forgotten. I want to say embossing, where you could feel the bumps, and the clearest is on this moon there. You can see the moon's actually you can feel it here. You can not indentation so much, but it actually sticks out from the surface of the box. You see the moon. So all this here, I could feel it all along here as well. It's just absolutely beautiful. The bottom I'm not so sure about. It says you are the dance of light and shadow. And then of course this is what I don't like, which apparently is commercially necessary, is this kind of, you know, a sample of the various decks that contains within. So I'll put this aside for now. I'm just going to, I don't know, should I do this? No, I really, really like that. So let's do that because I really like that. That can be like a little shrine, can't it? Now, it's a big deal that I could say I like this because some of you know that I held a very strong belief that tarot started off as an ordinary card game in Europe. And so any Egyptian thesis of tarot origin, I can't really subscribe to. And sometimes when I see Egyptian iconographies in tarot, I am often felt like I'm being persuaded to accept that thesis, and that often annoys me. I'm not saying that people who create tarot with Egyptian elements are insisting on their opinions, but you know, it's like some of you find it difficult to work with images of popes and popess, so you know, because it's not part of your belief system. So that's the Wheel of Fortune. I love Egyptian aesthetic. I just don't usually appreciate them in my tarot deck because it always reminds me of the Egyptian thesis of the origin of tarot. This is Justice. You can see here the collage photo of this particular human woman here. Looks antique, it looks vintage, it looks like it belongs in the early 1900s. That is not to say that the image is that old, I don't know, because sometimes you can create modern photography to look like it belongs in the early 1900s. Here the aesthetic of the human feels a lot more modern. Here we go back. This is Death, one of my favorite cards in the deck. Here we go back to feeling a bit more vintage. Again, I'm not claiming, I can't say whether the images are actually older or newer. It's just that the feel and the aesthetic of it feels vintage. And here we go back to modern, the human person. I quite like that. And consistent with the Starchild, I also found myself preferring where the cards don't show humans. Although I prefer it when the humans look vintage for some reason. Maybe because it is more in line with that memory that I have of the initial design of the Moonchild Tarot. That's another vintage looking woman there. This also looks like it belongs in the early 1900s. So this Judgment I would find challenging to work with because I see Judgment as an awakening, as resurrection. And here there's definitely that weighing of the heart and the feather and a kind of reckoning. Although in awakening and in resurrection, reckoning is often or can be implied, in this depiction of judgment, it's not only implied, but I think we'll put this aside for now. I think it's not only implied, but insistent upon. Maybe I'll put this here just so we know what we're looking at. This is the world. Extra card, shadow work. Extra card, divine wisdom. Extra card, Moonchild. What I found is that I love the aces and the queens, in particular when I saw the sample images on her website. And I absolutely adore this. And again, for me to be able to say that with all this Egyptian symbolism, it's just quite a big deal for me. And here we get that feel of the images from Starchild again. But it's more lush. It's less cosmos or less galactic, I think. It's more sort of earthy. The foliages, flowers and trees and jewelry, and 3 of Pentacles. So again, that feels, the humans feels more vintage there. 4 Pentacles. This is a bit more modern. This is modern, but I quite like it. This is the 6 of Pentacles, so it's a very interesting take on 6 of Pentacles. The generosity, the abundance is not outward but inward, even though this is a suit of earth. And that is part of that cosmology that I mentioned, which that is not to say that I do not believe in abundance inward, but for that kind of abundance, I would usually see the cups. So, and the swords. So that's inward abundance. 7 of Pentacles. There's a lot of, although I get the idea, but I also found that throughout the decks, there's a lot of this kind of images, people sort of in contemplation, in meditation, in inward focus. And it can feel like an opt-out. Although I get the idea, it can feel visually like an opt-out, because there it is again, a meditating woman. There it is again, a meditating woman. This is absolutely amazing, this lushness here. And I definitely prefer the less galactic theme. 9 of Pentacles. But I do miss the more vintage sense or feel of the initial draft of the Moonchild. This is Page of Pentacles. Again, the very strong sense of the aesthetic of the Starchild. And so, as I probably mentioned, there is a feeling of a maturation of the Starchild aesthetic here. It's almost as if the Starchild's matured into this, rather than a Moonchild, rather than a new child, a second child. This feels like, I want to say, a grown-up Starchild. I don't mean that in a disrespectful way, but the Starchild feels really young to me, maybe because I am 48 years old. The Queens in this deck is absolutely breathtaking. The Queens. I'm sorry to be repetitive. I just wish that the faces could remain vintage, so that, and the aces are beautiful. I suppose, like some of you, I like to be transported into a different world. This is the most blah card of the whole deck, in my opinion. And I have the likes of Urban Terror. I have the likes of the Next World. This is so beautiful to get real with. But when there is this kind of otherworldly theme, I want it to be totally otherworldly. This is very much like the Starchild for me. So I'm not, not too crazy about that one. This is again that sense of the Starchild there. I feel like I'm looking at a Vogue magazine, shall we say. So it's not that it's not beautiful, I just am not sure whether I want to see it in my tarot deck, that's all. And so yeah, so I have the Next World Tarot and the Urban Tarot and such decks to have a modern, relevant, today's world, face-to-face kind of world. But this the faces are both old and new, and I prefer them old, and the surrounding is very real as well as dreamy with all the lusciousness of plants and animals there. And I suppose I probably much prefer the lusciousness of earth and the older, more vintage photos of people. And in other words, I wish there's a lot more of the initial Moonchild in this deck, as well as the sort of sense of maturation of the aesthetic of the Starchild, because in some of the cards I felt that that happened, the combination of this maturation, of the maturing of the aesthetic that we find in the Starchild with the elegance of the old world photos collage into the deck, like this one here, into the cards. This is a new person, I think, a modern man, I think, but look at that. The aces and the queens, like this is, look at her dress, but I wish her face, I wish she's somebody from the early 1900s rather than this woman, this blonde lady from the 20th century. This feels very Starchild, this feels very Starchild. This is one of the blah card for me. This is very much a mature Starchild. Perhaps I say that, perhaps because I consider maturing in my own little world. I consider maturing as more having feet on the ground, more realistic, more of this earth, rather than the intergalactic head in the sky, because I used to be like that. So that's definitely a personal projection, but with all this, but aesthetically, I think other than that, aside from that, I think aesthetically it's just a lot more mature. I'm sorry to keep repeating myself, but it feels that way. So this feels like a mature Starchild, not only in its depiction of the cards, but also in the aesthetic. Maturing Starchild, maturing Starchild, 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 maturing Starchild, maturing Starchild. Beautiful. But if there's any kind of Moonchild that grew out of the old Moonchild, I probably in an ideal world would have loved to see the whole deck looking more like the aces and the queens here. It's just amazing. The king is amazing too. And the aces, look at that. Starchild. Starchild, 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 maturing Starchild, Moonchild, 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 Starchild, Starchild, Moonchild. Definitely the Moonchild that could have been, or the current Moonchild in its fullest expressive form. Look at that. I feel the essence of the current Moonchild is in the queens here in this deck and in the aces. It's just me. I am a person, and so I do have my subjective takes on things, and therefore I cannot be completely neutral. So that's very matured Starchild. That's kind of modern, but in a very, I don't know, it's just the next level, it feels. I'm not saying that the Starchild isn't as good. It's just, it just doesn't feel as mature, and I do not mean that in a disrespectful sort of less than way. And I quite like how this emperor is almost not quite, it's almost as if he is a black and white imposed into this hue, and I really quite like that. So he's a modern person, modern human, but he's collaged in here in a really interesting way, so it's quite different from that, for example. It's almost as if you're looking at the negative of an old film, colored in. I just want to quickly show you the aces. Look at that. Look at that queen. I'm not too impressed with the pages, so I might see if I just work with the aces and the queens and kings and see how that plays out. I quite like these two, but for now, just to be consistent, aces, king and queen, don't like that. Aces, king and queen. I feel like this would have been the perfect Moonchild, these ones here. It's so different from the Starchild. It's so different from its original idea of the Moonchild, but it's not. It's significantly different enough from the Starchild, and yet you can see how the aesthetic was born in the Starchild and sort of matured in these images, in my personal opinion. This is a personal opinion. And so I, for the moment, will use those in the majors only, which I've played around all morning this morning, and I found it to be quite good to read with just the majors. And so I'll use this. It shuffles really well, really nice and smooth. The edging, of course, is beautiful matte gold, so classy, so tasteful, so elegant, and so understated. Beautifully done, beautiful, beautiful. So I'm now using just the majors, the aces, the queens, and the kings. Strength, Chariot, and the Hermit. Perhaps to find balance within yourself, to reign over yourself, to be the best that you can be, you need to look inward, and you need to take some time alone. So I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.